Well, welcome back to Becoming America. My name is Judge Jim Gray. They sometimes call me the judge. And with me are my two colleagues, co-hosts, Dr. Jo Ellen Chatham. We call her sometimes the professor, and of course, the Honorable Bijan Kian, which we call very frequently the American. But we are here in a 17-part series to discusses and converses the Constitutional Convention of 1787, as well as those who drafted that Constitution and bequeathed it to us. So we've been talking to scholars, writers, experts about the men who drafted the Constitution, the times they lived in, as well as, of course, the issues they faced, and there were many. So we are here again today in the 13th episode. It's called Lonesome at the Top. And we're extremely honored today to spend some time with the president of the convention, who also became the first president of the United States. He prefers to be called General, but General George Washington. I think you've probably heard of him. I certainly have. So if you've been following Becoming America, you know that our goals are to educate, to inform, and to inquire and inspire about the Constitution, because it is worthy of that inspiration. But we'd also like to entertain a little bit. So we begin each session with a song from the new musical, Convention, the Birth of America. It was composed by Steve Lawless and me and arranged by Joel Henry Stein. So the song we're going to listen to now is Lonesome at the Top. To set the stage for that, the scene is there's a break in the action, a break in the convention, and George Washington is off to the side talking to Governor Morris, basically about the harms of slavery, about the issues they're facing, and also saying that, yes, the Constitution will be imperfect because everything is, but they'll have parts in there that can amend the Constitution as time goes along. And so while this is happening, Ben Franklin is off to the side, kind of ruminating, reflecting about this amazing man, this amazing patriot. I believe George Washington, candidly, is the best, strongest patriot the United States of America has ever had. And so while Ben Franklin is doing that, it comes to mind some sayings like, by George, curious George, lonesome George, real George. And in fact, the capper of that is, let George do it. And so that gives rise to this song. But you'd also kind of wonder, is there anyone else that have their name that has been used in so many sayings? Okay, I'm sorry to say there's maybe Jungle Jim, which is not particularly flattering. And I heard a woman recently saying that she has renamed the bathroom in her house from the John to the Jim, saying that it sounds better when she talks to her friends saying, I went to the gym this morning. But, you know, as a practical matter, I think it's because George Washington was so inspirational, was so multifaceted, that gave rise to these sayings. So at any rate, it's kind of fun, and that's what Ben Franklin says, but it also causes us all to ponder. So let's sit back and listen to It's Lonesome at the Top.
By George, I'm curious, George. Is it lonesome, George, at the top? From those Indian wars on to Valley Forge, you know you've been through, George, quite a lot. I know you must have been yearning, now that the war's been won, to get back down to Mount Vernon. Maybe get a little yard work done. Spend a little time with Martha. Maybe cozy up by the fire. Put your feet up on the hearth. Maybe think about when to retire. But just about then, your reverie ends when someone comes knocking at your door. Just one more time, we need you, George, so you saddle one time more. 'Cause you're the big man
George,
standing about 6'3".
Taller than one
You're the
of
real
these.
George.
big man George.
That's a whole lot taller than me. You're the go-to man.
Such a manly man.
You're the cream of the crop.
To the very last
but
drop.
I'll bet you
I'll bet you too.
It's lonesome at the top. And now that our convention is getting close to ending, I hardly need to mention that instead of king, they'll need a president, and then to set a precedent, you'll hear what you'd prefer to not hear said.
Let George do it.
That will be their cry, a call you can't deny. Become a New York president, our premier president. Now I don't mean to say you should eschew it, back away, slow down, or even stop. You really are the only one who can do it. But I know, by George, it's lonesome, George. It's lonesome at the top.
As usual, your songs are funny and they're also very clever, but they carry historical messages. And I think the message in this song, even though it's lighthearted, is that even in 1787, our founding fathers knew that there was really one indispensable man. He carried us through the Revolutionary War as commander-in-chief, and then at the Constitutional Convention, his presence was literally mandatory, because if he had not been there, we may not know the United States that we know today. Everybody knows about George Washington, but I'll give a very quick, brief summary of his life. He was born in the colony of Virginia in 1732, and his great-grandfather, John Washington, came from Sulgrave in England in 1656. In fact, Sulgrave, his ancestral home, is jointly owned by the United States and Britain as a historical monument. George Washington was a talented surveyor. He was appointed a major in the Virginia militia. And then in 1754, he was promoted to the rank of lieutenant colonel, and he engaged in an action with the French in the Ohio River Valley in a battle called the Battle of Jumonville, which actually sparked the French and Indian War. And in Europe, it was called the 7 Years' War. As relations with Great Britain deteriorated over the years, George Washington, along with many of his compatriots, began to oppose British rule and eventually declared independence. He was elected as a member of the Virginia delegation to the First Continental Congress, and in June of 1775, at the motion of John and Sam Adams, he was made commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. Then in October of 1781, he victoriously celebrated the surrender of the British at Yorktown. In 1787, he was elected as a delegate to the Constitutional Convention, which immediately elected him as its president. And once the Constitution was ratified in 1789, he became our first president. He truly was and is in our hearts and minds the indispensable man of America. And General Washington, we thank you so much for joining us today. Bijan and his beautiful wife, Gisu, and I actually met you the first time several years ago at your home in Mount Vernon. And with that, I would like Bijan, who is an American by choice, to begin our conversation with you.
Excellent. I'm very glad to be with you.
Thank you, Joe. Joe Washington, let me first thank you for your service. Under your leadership, America won its independence from Great Britain and created the first government under the Constitution. The contributions you have made to our country are without parallel, Joe Washington. As you know, Becoming America, this program, is about the Constitution and the Constitutional Convention of 1787, which drafted the Constitution, and you played a critical role in that part of the United States history. You were the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War, and the states were collaborating on the Articles of Confederation. There were many times when you were frustrated, General Washington, by the actions or inactions of the Confederation Congress. After the war, you wrote a letter to Virginia Governor Benjamin Harris that the government was a half-starved, limping government that appears to be moving upon crutches and tottering at every step. In your experience, General, what were the deficiencies in the Articles of Confederation?
Well, sir, I might first ask, how did you get a hold of the governor's correspondence between myself and he?
Well, we take a deep interest, General, in the history, and we are very keen in trying to understand what went on at the Constitutional Convention. So we do deep research, General.
Indeed, you must have. Well, I can tell you the defects of the Articles were numerous. However, I believe those that I would find to be the most critical, one is that we were not sufficiently united by these Articles. The treaties that could be made would apply, of course, expectedly to all the states. However, the states did not necessarily recognize the treaties that had been made, and any country that might have desire to negotiate directly with one of the states did in fact do so. And unfortunately, that was to the detriment of the other states always. So you might have a different treaty that you had for trade with Virginia as opposed to New York or Maryland. And of course, all of these have their own self-interests and were not ruled at all by the Congress and by what laws might be passed there. Other issues, of course, were that we have no court system under those Articles. This creates difficulty when you are trying to enforce laws between the various states that should apply to all states equally. There was no way to do so. And of course, in the end, the most troublesome issue that has risen up again is taxation. The Congress places taxes, but if Maryland does not pay, then New York certainly does not feel obliged to pay either. And there was, of course, no mechanism in place where one might expect there to be enforcement of those taxes. I would say those are the greatest weaknesses, although those are not the only weaknesses, certainly.
I think following on that topic, during the war, you had difficulty getting Congress to pay for a lot of the equipment you needed, for munitions, for stores, and also the pay of some of the, many of the soldiers who at times wanted to mutiny. Was that lack of pay and lack of back pay one of the reasons why Shays' Rebellion and other uprisings occurred in the United States after the war?
Well, Madam, we do not speak of it very often, but we almost saw such a revolution before the end of the war. When we were encamped at Newburgh in New York, there was some talk of dispensing with the Congress in order to receive their pay. These issues go to the very beginning of the Congress, when the Congress decided to issue their own bills. We, of course, printed paper money, and each bill said that you could exchange it for silver. There was one difficulty, of course, which was that the Congress had no silver. And so in a very short time, you can imagine that the bills went from being of $1 in value to being almost valueless. You could exchange at 100 continental dollars for one silver dollar. And so this created the initial difficulty in the fact that every time they did pay, it was with money they simply printed, with nothing behind it, if you can imagine such a preposterous notion. It was, by the end of the war, there were some men that had not seen pay in more than 3 years. which of course is completely intolerable. And there was a fear that if the war ended and they were to return home, they would have no inducement to pay them ever. And having been in Congress, I have no doubt that at some point someone may have even suggested so. This is an ongoing issue that has continued, that how does the Congress pay when Congress has no monetary resources of their own? And so it is under the Articles that this was a weakness that created great issue, not only for those who had given service, but for between the states and who was owed money and who had given during the war. And some states, of course, had nearly bankrupted themselves in service during the war. Other states had fared much better and saw themselves doing very well under the Articles of Confederation. Again, we were not united because in this instance, men from Virginia may say, we are very well and we have seen ourselves prosper under these articles. Why should we dispense with them? Where someone from one of the other states like New York might say, we have given all in our service and now we are being left alone to fail.
General,
I know you're, Jim,
every country.
Jim, before we move on, I'd like to mention something that I know the general would not mention because you're a very modest man, but you mentioned the Newburgh conspiracy. And we have heard from General Knox and others who were there that that entire movement was really stopped when you pulled from your pocket a letter you had said you had just received from Congress. And as you prepared to read it, you put on your spectacles or started to put them on and said, gentlemen, forgive me, but I have not only grown gray in service to my country, but also almost blind. In other words, you could not read without your glasses. And General Knox tells us that there were tears in the eyes of everyone there, and that basically ended the Newburgh almost revolt. Is that correct?
Well, Madam, as you say, I would not speak of such things myself. There were certainly those that were determined that there should be a break with Congress and that they would march upon the states. I felt it was my duty to remind them of who they were. I began this, however, not even by my arrival at that meeting, but by asking them to change the date of the meeting. And once that had been changed, it was set upon the Ides of March. This was to recall to them that there were other times when people thought that they were taking an opportunity to rid themselves of tyranny, which of course had been brought about by a military disruption of government. I wanted them to recognize that in this instance, they were upon the wrong side of that issue.
Well, I knew your modesty would prevent you from telling that story, but it's exactly one more example of your leadership of your men. So Jim, I'm sorry to have interrupted you.
No, and thank you for that, Professor, because this leads in right to what I was going to talk about, that every country, every nation needs leaders. And you, sir, are still a leader in our country. We are now several hundred years after the Constitutional Convention. And I am proud to tell you that your face is on the $quarter coin, or quarters. Your face is also on the $1 bill today, which is the most highly used, of course. And also that we have now a presidential library at your home or right next to it in Mount Vernon. So you are revered, sir, as being that leader, because countries need leaders. But going back, as I understand it, that James Madison, General Henry Knox, several others felt that your attendance at the Constitutional Convention was really essential, not only to its success, but even to be able to hold it in the first place. But I also understand, and I know that you are somewhat timid when it comes to putting yourself out in front, but you were reluctant to attend. What were your reasons for your hesitation to attend the Constitutional Convention to begin with, and what convinced you finally that you should and would attend?
Well, first of all, may I ask that I hope to be worthy of all that approbation, but I did request many times that my face never be placed on currency. In regards to the convention itself, I had no desire to leave Mount Vernon. As you said, you've been to my home, and you can understand that after 8 years of service, I was very glad to be home, not the least of which is to say my wife was very glad that I was at last home. I had told her when I departed that I should be home by Christmas, and I was, but it was some 8 years later than I anticipated. This was intended to be my retirement, and I intended to spend the rest of my days in domestic felicity. I had no intention of re-entering public life, and this would indeed be a return to public life. I had no desire to seek offices of government or seek power for myself. I was a citizen, and a very, very happy citizen. It was, of course, disturbing to see the failures that were occurring in our governments and the distresses that were being placed upon the many states. And so largely it was the distress that I had seen, and then the words of many who came to visit. And my home is never without visitors, many from the halls of government, that continually admonished me that it was critical that I be involved. Again, it was very difficult to accept that a retired general was going to be so important in amongst the giants of mind that were to be gathered. I was, of course, honored to be considered, but it was not my desire to do so.
Well, you gave in to the cry of "Let George do it."
I do not recall those being the words that were said, but I do recall that it was requested that I sit, and it was a very short time after we had arrived that it became apparent that they were going to ask me to serve as president of that convention. And I was very honored to do so.
General Washington, we read with keen interest what went on at the Constitutional Convention. And we have read Mr. Madison's detailed notes that he took at the convention. And allow me, General, to ask you a direct question, if I may, with apologies. You didn't say much during the convention proceedings. Why was that?
I am from Virginia, sir. And it is something that we have often felt was very important to government, that one listen and not speak. And in the position that I was in, if I were to weigh with any words upon an issue, it could unbalance that issue. I knew several of these men from my experiences during the war. Some of them had served under me. And I felt that if I was to speak in favor of a particular issue or against it, it could weigh the whole thing when the minds that were gathered within that room certainly were very capable of holding those conversations and discussions. And the more I listened, of course, the more I learned in every instance. And I've also believed it's a long-standing policy that when you are surrounded by men of genius, do not open your mouth to assure them that you are not to be in their company.
Well, General, one position you did take, if I understand it correctly, was that the proceedings were to be secret. They were not to be publicized. That was a position that you took at the beginning. And many people felt, oh, there was a conspiracy. What were your reasons? And I think you were successful, but give me your thinking as to that idea.
Yes, indeed, it does lay the ground that would make many people believe that there was something going on that was untoward. I was actually very surprised to hear that you have seen into Mr. Madison's notes. I can tell you that we had a concern that if the ideas that were being expressed were to go directly back to the people, before they could be consumed and digested properly, that it might alter the entire affair. In fact, this was one of the great difficulties I believed under the Articles of Confederation, is that each representative was not free to think or to hear argument on their own, but always had to respond to and be dependent upon the viewpoints of those from their home countries.
During the convention, you were elected president of the convention, but you did not always preside, particularly when there was a committee of the whole. Would you explain that process and why you did not preside when they were meeting as a committee and not as the convention?
Certainly. The committees, of course, are arranged very much so in the fashion of Parliament before it. The committees are created in order to look at any particular issue or any proposal and to further that with a small amount of people without a larger amount of contribution and debate amongst them. And so, for instance, the very first committee that I recall was the Committee of Rules. And you found men who were experts in creating rules. We went with the names of Pinckney and Hamilton and Wythe, all of whom, of course, are lawyers. They were exceptional for laying down what would be our guides as we continued in this process. A committee of the whole is just as you imagine it. It is a committee of the whole body, and they will be having conversation and putting forth ideas, yet they will still be acting as a committee. Each committee has its own, I will say, president, but it is a head of the committee. And so there was a head of the committee that was already placed over the committee of the whole at that time. So there was no need for my participation at that moment. So I departed while that continued. And of course, that committee that I believe you're speaking of was originally conceived to debate and consider the Virginia Plan,
which was written primarily by James Madison, although he did not offer in the convention. What was your relationship like with James Madison?
What was my relationship like with James Madison?
Or what is it? I'm assuming it's still continuing.
I will discuss that I had always been very impressed with the mind of Mr. Madison. He and I have found ourselves to have traveled down different paths in our thinking since that time.
Would you like to share what those paths are?
Well, Madam, I do not wish to disparage Mr. Madison. There are some disagreements between us upon the scope of government and the authority of government.
General Washington, as we continue to ask questions about your relationship, sir, with others who were or were not at the convention, I'd like to ask the question that Dr. Chatham asked you, General, about Mr. Madison. I'd like to ask a question about Mr. Jefferson. What was your relationship like, General, with Mr. Jefferson, and between Mr. Madison and Mr. Jefferson, what was the difference in the intensity of the differences in the paths that you took in your thinking?
Again, you are speaking over our relationship of many years and our interactions over them. I knew Mr. Jefferson's father before I knew Mr. Jefferson, Mr. Peter Jefferson, who had also served in the House of Burgesses. Mr. Jefferson is another person who has a very nimble mind and a very capable pen. And his thinking and his contributions in service both within the United States and overseas have been numerous. I and he have come to a point that we do not communicate much. He seems to do most of his communications through the newspapers. At this time, it is best not to ask about Mr. Jefferson when you are in the company of my good wife.
During the convention, General, you worked 6 days a week, took Sundays off, and then there was a long 11-day recess. And during those days off, getting away from the proceedings of the convention, you did things like you went fishing, you went to the theater, you visited friends, but you also went to Valley Forge again, where you and your troops had spent that very difficult winter about a decade before. What were your thoughts when you went back to Mount Vernon on that short visit?
My goodness, but have you been in my journals?
Yes, sir, I have.
That you would know where I have spent my time in Philadelphia. Indeed, I did have opportunity to return to the Valley of the Forge, and it was a very different experience, I can tell you, than my first experience there. It was warmer, for one thing, very much so. However, as looking about, I saw the faces of many, some no longer with us, and some that are just not as familiar now because of distance and time. But those who had served through that very long winter, of course, we had some terrible moments within that winter, but we had some moments of great elevation and great promise. It was there that we first heard that the French were to come to our aid and were to become allies. It was there that we first had General de Steuben, who joined us and remade our army into what it could be. And so during that time, while we had great sickness, we had great deprivation, we also had moments that you could see the hand of almost a divine providence laying upon us that was directing us towards a better day to come, which of course, as soon as we broke camp, it seemed as if all the dreariness and all the sickness that had laid upon us was suddenly lifted. And we had our first great engagement against the British after that.
General, hats off to you yet again, as well as the men that served with you. It just was an amazing tale, an amazing story of courage. You were, of course, the president of the Constitutional Convention. And can you tell us your views as to maybe the most important issues that were addressed, debated, and decided upon, as well as who were the most effective delegates throughout the process?
The most effective delegates, that in itself is a question that one must ask, who is being effective to what end? Because you could certainly say that Mr. Mason, also a neighbor here in Virginia, was very effective at bringing out his point of needing a Bill of Rights, which I particularly did not think was needed, yet he was effective in making that argument. Mr. Madison, of course, cannot be denied. Mr. Gouverneur Morris, of course, was very effective and very important. And I think perhaps not respected as much in his contributions is Mr. Roger Sherman. The most important things that were decided, I think, was the final shape and authority of what was to become the government, and that they would have abilities now to promote the future that we had hoped for our posterity. Until that time, it was a doubtful thing whether or not we would see success come, even after so many years, to ensure our independence, of whether or not we could continue as an independent nation, or if in fact we could see a dissolution and a breaking apart of all of the states. So that unity was by far the most important achievement. I would say also the understanding that we knew at the time the nature of human beings, and that they are imperfect, that we made a system of government as strong as we could to take into consideration those imperfections, yet also left a path to amend that Constitution, as we were very aware at the time that there were defects over time that would need that amendment.
Can I follow up and ask you why you yourself believed that we did not need a Bill of Rights? I tend to agree with you, because if you start enumerating specific rights, that means if something isn't there, then maybe it's neglected. But what were your thoughts as to why we did not need a Bill of Rights, General?
That is very much so my reason as well. The assumption, of course, is that this document lays out simply what the government may do. These are the government's powers. They do not have powers beyond this. And so every other power, every other right is still belonging to the people and to the states.
I can tell you that you did say that in the 9th and 10th Amendments in the Bill of Rights, and regretfully as a judge, I regret to tell you that they have been really ignored and throughout our history there since, and I think that's been to our detriment. So I think you were correct.
I don't understand, after so much toil and sacrifice, why the people would be willing to give up those rights.
Well, they certainly discussed it in all the ratification conventions, the role of the federal government to become more energetic as they described it. They knew something was necessary, but they were afraid to give too much control to the federal government at the expense of the states. And you mentioned Roger Sherman. He was very instrumental in making sure that the states were represented equally in the Senate and then proportional in the House of Representatives. They also discussed at length the executive. The Articles of Confederation didn't have an executive. They were afraid of an executive that would be too strong and could become another monarch. But you were elected the first president. And the second article of the Constitution doesn't describe the presidency in nearly the great detail as Article 1 describes the Congress. For example, there was no cabinet. They talked about having a council of revision and different helps for the president, but how did you as president establish the first cabinet, and what was in your mind as you organized the executive branch?
When you are saying cabinet, you're referring to my advisors?
Yes, what developed over time was a group of department heads that eventually became called the cabinet.
Oh, that is clearly laid out within the Constitution. It says that each one of the heads of departments should, at time to time, advise the executive. And so that was not my creation or anything to do with my imaginations. That was laid out very clearly for me. I felt that while I certainly stepped on untrodden ground, that there was a reason that there was not much detail given, as this position of president is only to extend to certain areas. There are only certain powers that are given to the presidency. And certainly we very quickly found out some of those limitations. There is no need for more description, as there is not much more to the actual endeavors of the president and the actual actions of the president than what are clearly laid out. So I did not feel that I was designing or was perhaps laying out as an architect this office. Yet I knew that everything I did would in fact set a precedent, which was my great concern. And so I tried to limit as best I could what actions I took, or anything that even began to look as if it ran beyond those limits within the Constitution. The Constitution was the guide that I never once abandoned.
There were fears in the country, even after you became president, that it would devolve into a monarchy. There were some people who actually wanted a monarchy. Even during the convention, there was a brief little kerfuffle over an article that appeared in one of the newspapers that they were planning to bring over one of King George's son to be the monarch. Did you ever have concerns about the presidency becoming a monarchy? And what did you do? How did you manage those concerns?
No great concern. Before the convention, there was certainly some talk of possibly the need for a sovereign, and whether that was an elected sovereign or how that was to be accomplished was not at that time discussed. We knew that there needed to be a more direct form of government than what was currently in place. The presidency, however, certainly is very, very far from that. And I'm sorry, I've lost the line of what you were asking specifically, because I found it so interesting the way you asked there. Can you please repeat what you were asking?
What actions did you take, if any, to sort of calm the fears of some that you would become a monarch or remain in office for the rest of your life? In fact, even how John Adams, your vice president, wanted to describe you and your position became somewhat controversial. So what actions did you take?
Was largely the fact that I had agreed to take this position calmed many fears, because I, of course, have shown myself more than once to not have interest in furthering any ambitions within government or for more power. So I understood from the beginning that that was part of what I was to do. Now, Mr. Adams, to his credit, he is an excellent mind. He sometimes goes beyond that which other men around him are willing to follow. He himself proposed a title, and it was far too grand. One had to recognize that we were now a democratic republic, and that as such, we had to recognize that the government was of people. It was a government of the people. And so we took many, I would say we took many stances in order to let people know that we were not going to expand beyond that, and that we were not becoming monarchical. However, I was accused regularly of doing so. There were times when people stood in the streets and yelled death to Washington. I can tell you my wife spent many a sleepless night in our home because of that. Mr. Adams did have one very important suggestion within his great and grandiose title that I was sorry could not be adopted for obvious reasons. And that was that part of the title he suggested was and protector of their rights, as part of the title for the President of America, which is very clearly in the description of the presidency. And yet it is something that I feel has been overlooked often, is that is, as that is meant to be understood, that the president is to protect the rights of the people. So I was not, while I knew at the time that Mr. Adams' title that he had suggested was far, far too grand, at the same time, I did recognize what he was trying to express and what he hoped to accomplish, which was also that there would be respect for the office of the presidency from those that are overseas. Because when you are meeting with a vizier or a czarina, or you're discussing things with a king or a potentate, of course, they have these grand titles, and it does seem rather small to say someone is merely the president. However, this was very much so in keeping with our new mindset and how we saw ourselves.
Was your decision to retire from office after 2 terms a part of that thinking of ensuring that this would not become a lifelong monarchy or hereditary position?
I had actually decided to retire after my first term, madam. Unfortunately, that was not to be. And so, yes, of course, the stepping away from power is something that was not difficult for me in the least, although some seem to think it was an extraordinary measure. I assure you that there was no difficulty in my mind in concluding my presidency. I think that it does set, hopefully, a good precedent for those to follow.
Mr. General, we've talked about Mr. Adams, Mr. Jefferson, Mr. Madison. Give us your thoughts with regard to Alexander Hamilton, who many felt was a brash young man. He was fairly young and he was fairly brash, I suppose. But if I understand history, he had said, "Where do you wish me to serve our country once you were elected president? Should I be Secretary of State or Secretary of the Treasury?" And you responded Secretary of the Treasury, which in my view is an extremely wise decision because he did help our stability. But give us your relationship with Alexander Hamilton and your thoughts about him, please.
Of course, I met Mr. Hamilton during the war, and he served in my military family. He was the most ready penman amongst all of my aides. And I have missed greatly over time the years that we were not in the same household. His great pen, his mind, very, very active, and his company has always been of great asset to me. Mr. Madison, of course, could have easily been Secretary of State. He certainly understood foreign minds and their desires. However, he was greatly useful in the capacity of finance, as he had spent a good deal of time in finance, and his understanding of the machinations of finance certainly were impressive long before he ever had opportunity to think about such an office. So I was very, very pleased that he was willing to accept that. And he did not remain just in that role, however. There were many times that he was forthcoming with advice on many other subjects, sometimes not even requested advice. You refer to him as brash. That is a term that some may use. He is certainly a man who never seems at rest. And because of that, I have been greatly benefited, because even while I was sleeping, I knew that he was always working.
General Washington, we've been talking about some very serious issues that went on at the convention. The question I'd like to be permitted to ask, General, is a bit more personal. On the night of your election, who informed you that you've been elected the President of the United States? And please tell us a bit about the emotions associated with that, and how did you feel? Where was Mrs. Washington at that time? And tell us a bit about your personal feelings and emotions, if I may ask, General.
Well, I generally do not speak about my personal reactions and personal issues. However, those topics today, I feel, are certainly, if you feel that they will be of use, I will speak of this. I did not know when I was elected. It was sometime afterwards, before word reached me. And to my recollection, it was Charles Thompson, the Secretary of Congress, who came to my home at Mount Vernon. And of course, I had known him since my time within the Congress. And he told me that I had been elected. And it was not unexpected. We had known that it was considered. I had to accept that it was a possibility. I think my wife was very reticent to accept it. She had spent more than half the war with me in camp. And she never had desire, I believe, to leave our country of Virginia again. She was quite pleased to be at home, and as is her nature, and I was quite pleased to be with her. So there was no joy from her or from the household under this circumstance. We knew from the beginning that this was re-entering service, and that we would be serving the people again, as we had previously, just in a different theater of conflict, perhaps. Politics has never been something that, since I left the Congress, that I've ever wished to return to. So it was a moment of not unlike a criminal being led to his place of execution, I'm afraid.
General, what was your inauguration like?
Very loud, madam. It was so, the streets were so busy and so full of people that I could not get a carriage to take me back to my house. I could not, in fact, get a horse. I had to walk amongst the crowd in order to try and find my way back afterwards. It was a day that one truly feels the weight of the world upon their shoulders, knowing what lay before me and what I must do, and in some instances, not knowing what all that might entail. It was certainly, I felt great honor, but I felt great responsibility that had been laid upon my shoulders.
General, please accept our genuine thanks of all of us and all of our viewers for sharing your time with us and your thoughts. As you know, we have written this musical convention, The Birth of America, which gave rise to our discussions here. Your song, It's Lonesome at the Top, was, and you just described it, was Lonesome at the Top. That was song number 13. Song number 16 was our, in effect, finale. We are sitting in what's now called Independence Hall, of course, which is where the Constitutional Convention was held. You sat in the chair behind me, and on the back is a sun. And Ben Franklin was quoted as wondering throughout the convention, was this sun going to be rising or setting? He finally decided, yes, it's going to be rising. And that was the name of our finale. Then at the end of that, the curtain went down, but the curtain came up again because we had an encore written actually by Steve Lawless, my friend. But The encore was Ben Franklin, who is our moderator, came out onto the stage, beckoned you to come out with him, and then, look, wait a minute, more candle power. Look, there's an audience out here. What year are we? Oh, we're, my goodness, 200 and something years later. Mr. Washington, is there anything you would like to tell our prodigy here, the people and now of the United States of America? And we had you saying, yes, now it's you are the we. In other words, it's your responsibility to carry it forward, carry it on, our Constitution and our liberties. Does this accurately describe your thoughts? Had you been able to address your descendants 200 and something years later, is that what you would have said?
There was never a moment during 8 years of war and 8 years of service in the presidency that posterity was not foremost in our minds. We did not design and plan and labor and bleed because we thought it would better simply our days. We very much so always imagined those that would come after us. And it is very much so their responsibility. We have given you every advantage we could think of. And unfortunately, some of those advantages that we very much so wish to give you, we did not, although many efforts were made. What you do with it is in your hands. Liberty, by its very nature, must be protected and must be defended because its natural state may not be in command. There are always those that wish to rule. And so if you wish to maintain your liberties, it does fall to you, but do not do it simply because it is what you desire for the day. Do it because you also have posterity and make their lives better as well.
Thomas Jefferson once said, as I understand it, that most bad government comes from too much government. Do you agree with that?
Well, Mr. Jefferson and I have very much so come to disagreements about what is too much government and what is too little. However, we certainly saw too much government that caused our revolution. And so it has always been our desire to build a government that is just strong enough to do what must be done, and no stronger than that. The questions will always be debated about how far those lines are, but please always keep in mind that to entrust government with more power than necessary is certainly a pathway that always leads to tyranny.
General, I hate to say that our time has really come to an end for this wonderful conversation with you. Are there any last thoughts that you would like to leave with us?
Madam, I cannot imagine what else might be said than what has been said. I'm very appreciative to have been in your company today, and I hope you have great success with your endeavors.
General, on behalf of us all, with my mind, with my heart, with my soul, sir, I salute you and your colleagues. Thank you for what you have done. You have been a great man.
Thank you for your kind words, sir.
As literally your descendants, as countrymen, as Americans, as citizens of the United States, who we thank you very much for your service, both in military service and in civilian service. Sir, you don't know this, but we do because we live as your descendants. James Madison became known as the father of the Constitution because of his role at the convention, because we were later in life, after he died, we were able to read his notes. But just so you know, you have been known to all of us, your descendants, as the father of the United States. And we thank you so much for the time that you have given us today. It's been very, very important. And for those who are watching, if you want to learn more about this series, you can go online. And it's at the credits at the end of the program to show how to go online. But in the meantime, you can also listen to the song, It's Lonesome at the Top, as well as the other songs in this series by logging on to judgejimgray.com, and you'll find the songs. Also, you can get a day-by-day blog on what happened at the convention beginning on May 25th going all the way through September 17th, as well as the ratification discussions by going to Concordia University Irvine Center for Public Policy and reading the blog. In our next program, we will be having a conversation with Dr. Gordon Lloyd, who is one of the foremost current commentators and scholars on the Constitutional Convention. So we will see you next time. And General Washington, again, our eternal thanks to you. And please give your best to your beautiful wife, Martha Washington.
Thank you, General. Thank you. Thank you for your kind words. And please know that nothing was done that was any more than duty demanded.
Thank you.
Thank you, General.